Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and partner here at TCS, and I want to thank each of you for being here on the show today. My guest is Ashok Krish. Thanks for joining us, Ashok.
Pleasure.
Ashok is the global head of digital workplace here at TCS, and I've heard great things about his level of experience and just insight into this area. So this is an area that I think is very important to just about everyone that would be listening to this call today. So before we get started, Ashok, where are you calling in from?
Chennai, India. That's in South India.
Absolutely. I've had the phenomenal opportunity to be able to spend time there. Beautiful place, enjoyed my time. I visited churches, I visited temples, I visited historic places along the coast and different things, and read a whole book about it before I got there, just to try to get some background. So beautiful place. Thanks for joining us again today. So you have been here at TCS for over 20 years now.
Yep, 23 years now.
Yeah, 23 years. How has the past 2 years of the pandemic made it different from all the rest?
It clearly feels like an inflection point. It feels like an inflection point between the traditional definition of a workplace and extending that to the idea of offshore development versus nearshore development. And it feels like we've sort of permanently switched to a world where location really doesn't matter anymore. And I think we will sort of permanently be in this hybrid way of working, depending on the task at hand and so on. And I think it feels like an inflection point. Many of the assumptions we made about what worked in person and what worked remote, all of those assumptions were challenged. And I think clearly there are elements where I think as a human species, we still like to see each other face to face. But clearly there are many things that we can do perfectly fine being remote. And I think it's a huge inflection point. And the fact that we've actually largely been more productive, and my particular unit has, if anything, significantly grown in revenue and size, really tells us that this is where the world is indeed headed.
So what are you hearing around that debate on whether people should work remote or hybrid or come to the office? Where's that debate today?
It's still in a very tricky place, to be honest. There are dimensions such as geographical variations in how this debate is held, also industry specific, and more importantly, even within a company, it's possible that some kinds of roles are perhaps having this conversation differently from certain other kinds of roles. And so it's really a very interesting time, because it's pretty obvious that there's no one single easy answer. The answer is pick the model that works for that role and that persona in that company, in that industry, in that geography and culture, based on what works for you. And I think that's where we are actually at. I mean, if you ask an IT developer, they'd happily continue working from home because it offers them that flexibility. As a junior developer in IT, 80 or 90% of the work you do can be done remotely. And obviously the 10 or 20% is when you need to meet with people, understand requirements, perhaps do design, and those kinds of high empathy kinds of activities that you need human contact for. But if you're a human resources leader, or if you're someone in leadership, I think the sense that you're not seeing people really affects a lot of people's styles of leadership. And we sort of have this bias towards extroverted styles of leadership, where we want to see each other, we want to talk to people, we want to impress them, we want to sort of inspire them. And it's interesting. So we've actually seen introverted managers often do better at remote management than extroverted leaders, and so on. And I think if you see between industries, you see the larger financial services companies, which have always been focused on creating these sort of big skyscraper, fantastic, rich offices for the last 100, 150 years, where you cannot think about doing, high frequency trading and that kind of work while sitting at home. Many of those have security as well as cultural requirements for you to be in person, furiously brainstorm and figure things out. And at the same time, you have other companies that are really saying, you know what? There are certain things my frontline staff need to be in person, but everyone else, honestly, all support staff can be remote. as far as we care. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to provide support by all being co-located in one place. You can do so while being remote and distributed. And so it's a very interesting conversation. On the one hand, there is the diversity and inclusion angle. Clearly, companies have gotten used to the fact that having a flexible hybrid work policy allows you to attract a more diverse and therefore better talent pool around the world, right? It's pretty evident that a diverse team is a better team. It's not a compliance thing or something for you to do PR about. I mean, the science is out there, and so that again balanced with the fact that many work cultures were created in an in-person office. They were not created for remote work. And so there is this fear that these companies are losing that sort of sense of culture, that sense of belonging. And you can see that in the high levels of attrition in almost every industry. And so these are all the different sort of things that are really bubbling out there. I don't think there are any easy answers.
Wow. So how did you personally get involved and get your focus on your career around digital workplace? I love to hear experts and leaders, because rarely does a person end up where they started. And,
Yep.
and it's fun to learn their journey. Talk to us about your journey.
Yeah. So my journey at TCS is interesting in the sense that I started out in the insurance domain as someone who worked on mainframe technologies when I first started out in the late 1990s, around the Y2K era is when I started. And essentially, pretty quickly, around the turn of the millennium was the first generation of what we call web technologies. That was when Java was becoming a technology of choice. And obviously, I jumped to embrace that and said, hey, you know what? I don't want to do the mainframe stuff. I want to do the newer things and so on. So in a sense, the early part of my career was driven by an obsession with the newer, albeit less mature technologies, at any given point of time. And after about 6 or 7 years, working in the insurance business per se, and I was in the United States when I was doing this. I then sort of had this opportunity to sort of meet the TCS Chief Technology Officer. And again, almost like a startup pitching to a VC, I gathered a couple of other people who I was working with in TCS outside of my core job role and said, look, we have this idea. And we're seeing, this was around 2006, when we said, look, there's this new interesting phenomenon on the internet. It's called social media. And this is phenomenon called Web 2.0. The internet seems to be changing the way people collaborate. And internet is changing from that one-sided, publish model to a two-way conversation mode. And interesting things are happening with the whole era of blogging, with Yahoo Answers, with the first generation of social networks like Orkut from Google, and so on. Facebook was still not really well known. And so you had all of these things bubbling up. And so we made a pitch to the Chief Technology Officer of TCS that, look, I think there is something in here for a large company like TCS, that if we could build these kinds of tools for the workplace, it would be interesting. It would be an interesting experiment in really getting the voice of the employees in areas like knowledge management, in areas like capturing tacit knowledge, in areas like detecting expertise. Again, as TCS grew from, when I joined 8,000 employees to by then in 2006, 100,000 employees, it was already big. We are now 500,000. It's at a different scale. It had already gotten to the point where nobody knew where all the experts were. Right. But we knew experts existed. We knew knowledge existed, but nobody knew who they were. And so we made a pitch that we would start a research lab that focused on experimenting on social technologies for the enterprise. And mind you, this was well before Microsoft was thinking about Yammer or all these other companies, Workplace by Facebook, and all these other technologies. This was almost a decade before those things became mainstream, right? And the Chief Technology Officer basically said, fine, I'll give you 20 people and 6 months. Show me what you can build, and let's use TCS as a guinea pig, right? I have 100,000 employees. Build me something, we'll make it go live, and let's see if it works. And so my team built a series of these initial, very almost first of its kind enterprise social collaboration tools that were modeled on consumer sort of Web 2.0 tools for the enterprise. And unsurprisingly, they did really, really well. Right? They were also hard to moderate. there were those challenges, but clearly, I think the organization recognized that, oh, there's something in this here, right? So there is a mechanism, there's a design philosophy that makes things two-way, that is interesting, that's challenging, and so on. And so after that, my career has largely been focused on working with the chief technology officer and often directly the CEO on building future of work technologies for TCS internally for many years, for till almost 2014, right? And at that point, we transformed the learning systems to make it anytime, anywhere, micro learning based. We transformed our performance management systems to make it conversational. We transformed knowledge management systems. We transformed a whole bunch of these things. We eventually introduced things like Microsoft Teams and so on. So that was largely the focus. And then at some point of time, the chief technology officer said, well, enough, doing stuff for TCS, now go make money, right? And so that is when I said, well, let's do this, but for our customers. And then obviously that's how we started Digital Workplace and started expanding our footprint in terms of all workplace technologies, right? Office 365, you name it, right? Everything that touches employee experience is something that we do. So that's been my journey.
Thank you for sharing this, Ashok. That's awesome. So now I want you to walk us back over 2 years ago to maybe January, February of 2020. Suddenly, COVID is kind of starting to rise in the news. Walk us through what happened there and what, did you start getting phone calls from leadership? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, this was, so when this happened, March was actually when India started locking down at a serious level, right? In a very short amount of time, the government asked companies to say, well, you have about 24 hours, shut everything down and move everyone, home, right? And so it was actually, so it was fortunate, obviously, that we had sort of foreseen a lot of these things. And so we had already had everyone adopt Teams and OneDrive and cloud collaboration technologies that allowed us to really rapidly be able to do this, right? And so clearly, I think, but when all of this happened, it was a huge logistical challenge first, and two, a cultural challenge secondary. The technology was the easy part, right? Getting people, the fact that most people had laptops and we already had cloud collaboration tools, that was the easy part. And for millennials to collaborate remotely, not a problem at all, right? The logistical challenge was obviously that many people were stuck in their hometowns. They were not even in the cities where our TCS offices are, right? So the logistical challenge, so we had to put together a team of people across TCS, from administration, facilities, people with supply chain backgrounds and IT background, and so on, and security, more importantly, right? Because we had to convince our customers that you should let us continue to do your work with a guy sitting in a small town in India, connecting via the open internet, but via VPN from a personal laptop. So all of this was very new. A chief security officer of a Fortune 500 company would have just said, no way, before the pandemic. But every single one of them said, yeah, we're good. So we're going to audit what you're doing. We're going to do more security tests. But yeah, we need to keep the lights on, right? And so interdisciplinary group of us basically got calls to say, look, we need to design a mechanism that allows people to stay connected, still feel a sense of belonging, have a sense for what is going on, because I think you're not in the office, so you don't have ambient awareness. So we put together a plan that essentially had senior leaders like the CEO and the heads of these units do more regular town halls, but shorter form, right? So almost like TED Talks, right? So more communicate at a higher frequency, continuously keep telling people what's going on, create more open channels where information is public by default as opposed to private by default, drive the adoption of Microsoft Teams so that everyone stays connected, and introduce things like corporate communication chatbots that continuously sort of ping people, hey, here's what you need to know, here's what's happening. And by the way, here's the new rules that you're not allowed to travel, and what to do in case somebody fell unwell and needed hospital access, and we had to help them. And so all of these things, it was not so much dealing with just work. We had to deal with the work-life continuum all of a sudden of employees, right? So earlier, office just had to deal with work. And once you left office, you're on your own. And all of a sudden, the company needs to care for you 24/7 because it's a work-life continuum, right? You're context switching between work and then cooking, childcare, schools were shut down, and then all of a sudden, kids were running around the house. And so the whole idea of how you think about sensitize people to things like you can't have 5-hour status meetings, you can't block people's calendars for 30 hours a week, they will burn out. Start to use more data to detect these kinds of things. So I think it was a phenomenal effort to get 500 people to start working remotely. At our peak, 96% of our workforce was working remotely.
Oh man.
Right. And so that is incredible. Yeah.
Ashok, I was the recipient of a lot of those messages, and to tell you the truth, I was very impressed. It wasn't just about work, as you pointed out. My experience as an employee is there was things like how to watch the health of your eyes. So you're not just staring at the screen and losing your eyesight. How to rest those every 20 minutes. There was all those yoga classes that are being offered. There was the online concerts by just beautiful and phenomenal musicians that were playing music for all of us. I mean, there was suddenly TCS was, as I saw it, really looking at that 24-hour-a-day health of their employees and family members. I remember all kinds of information about how to live and work in the same place and how to just respect the boundaries and all those kinds of things. So let's talk about employee experience, not just within TCS, but over the other large companies that you're in contact with. Has employee experience become a much bigger issue and focus for large companies today?
It is. So historically, part of my challenges with growing revenue was the fact that for large companies, employee experience was distinctly a second priority in comparison to customer experience. All the dollars were spent on customer experience. Employee experience was at best seen as a cost center, something that I need to optimize, something I need to outsource to reduce cost. And when I outsource not because I want a better experience, but because I want a lower cost. Outsource support, outsource, IT, outsource management of desktops and so on. And it's, I can be quite candid in saying that most employee experiences in most of the large companies, not really great, very disjointed, very heterogeneous, largely broken. Onboarding an employee was quite painful. You can have the most amazing people, but the technology journeys didn't really tie everything together. Most people often, had wasted time just simply being productive and so on. And this was the fundamental issue with employee experience. The second thing about the history of employee experience is that if you look at the arc of technologies that affected employee experience over the last 2 decades or so, you had it in distinctly different waves. You had the first wave of ERP tools that largely sort of sought to make your day-to-day business operations for your employees more straightforward, right? Then you started having the sort of like the HR-centric ERP tools that focused on payroll, employee and hire to retire, and those kind of processes, right? Then at some point of time, you had the personal computer that kind of came in, and then all of a sudden you had productivity tools, you had PowerPoint and Excel and those kinds of things. And then you got email, and then that went into video and audio conferencing, and then ultimately things like Teams that brought everything together. So that's been the evolution. And then parallelly, you had a series of technologies that dealt with workflows and basically getting work done, from everything to getting approval to procure something to essentially getting an IT ticket solved. There is this huge ecosystem of workflow and other processes and content management systems and workflow systems that deal with all of this. Now, historically, because of the disparate nature of these technologies, they were operating completely in silos. So the HR person didn't really care about collaboration, despite the fact that you can't really be effective at HR without really thinking about collaboration and two-way communication, right? But the guy in charge of Microsoft Teams or the guy in charge of video conferencing has no clue about HR. And the person in charge of automating workflows has no clue about either HR or that. And they end up designing terrible processes and workflows that make life easier for administrators and not for end users. And so therefore, we're left with these painful processes in every company, right? That are often, anyone looking at it would say that, this could be designed better. And the reason they're not designed better is because these are all operating in silos. One of the things that has happened is that technologically, all of these are now converging, right? You see the likes of Microsoft and ServiceNow and Workday and these technologies converging all of this and saying, hey, you know what? We can now really create fantastic integrated user journeys, from onboarding to hiring to getting an employee and having a fantastic experience, just swiping their card, getting to the office, getting a laptop that's already ready on day one, a lot of self-service, the ability for a company to continuously communicate. As you said, you're doing live concerts and doing town halls more effectively. Now that we have that kind of ecosystem, the combination of the evolution of the technology, its huge amount of adoption during the pandemic by literally forcing companies to adopt them, and also the great resignation and people resigning if companies didn't do this, essentially meant that what used to be something that you would simply look at as a cost center because it was so heterogeneous and messy, now became a board level subject. Employee experience and retention became a subject that boards were talking about. And all of a sudden, it's not just the CIO, but the CEO who is really interested in employee experience. And it is literally a life or death. If companies cannot hire and retain digital interdisciplinary talent, they will not survive, not just the pandemic, but they will not survive digital disruption. So I think in that sense, there is now this growing realization that this has to be seen in a holistic fashion. And we have to spend in a different manner. I can't just throw $25 million at a HR transformation, $10 million at installing a state-of-the-art video conferencing tool and hope they both independently sort of work out. You've got to think about them together. And I think that's the new world. And that's the opportunity, I think, to think about employee experience in a fundamentally different way.
So where do we go from here, Ashok? If we were to put on our futurist hat and look forward 5 years, how do you anticipate this will continue to evolve? What will things look like for employee experience 5 years from now?
I think, always predicting the future is always dangerous business, but so let me take a crack at it, right? So 5 years, the way I see it, one is that I think the fundamental nature of employment in many roles in many industries will change. In that, I think the gig worker or the freelance worker model for a wider range of tasks beyond, logistics and transportation and those kinds of slightly lower paying jobs will extend to areas like digital and design and development and a whole range of other data science and other artificial intelligence and critical areas critical to business. And so I think companies will have to fundamentally rethink the binary distinction between a full-time employee and a contractor and have a range, a spectrum of ways in which you can onboard people. Tactically, temporarily, sometimes for a longer period of time, task-specific, skill-specific, and so on. So I think companies today often have very clunky ways in which they onboard both full-time as well as part-time employees. Large companies will need to figure out agile, nimble ways in which they can find talent anywhere in the world. So that the company that is able to staff an artificial intelligence developer for a critical retail supply chain problem, for instance, and have that person be, let's say, in Manila, Philippines, because, hey, by the way, we have a remote work culture, it's all agile, is at a distinct advantage than a company that says, I need this person, I need them to be in San Francisco, paying unaffordable, housing rates, and also compete with all of the other startups that are competing for the same talent in San Francisco. I think those kinds of companies are going to lose out, right? So in that sense, I think first and foremost, this fundamental change to what I call the human cloud model of how you think about talent, right? Just the way you have compute and storage, the human cloud in terms of talent, I think will become a reality for a lot of companies that succeed. The second thing that I clearly see is that technologically, I think our experience of remote work will hopefully improve beyond the boring two-dimensional screens of Zoom or Teams that we now use into more immersive metaverse, virtual reality and augmented reality driven interfaces as those devices and 5G becomes a lot more real. You're going to have certain things, certain kinds of meetings. I'm not saying we'll put on a VR headset and spend 8 hours. I think, it's going to be quite painful. I will probably do it for half an hour for very critical meetings, for certain very high-level employee engagement. I'd have loved to attend that concert on a virtual reality headset as opposed to watch it on Teams and so on, and things like that. Or maybe communities of practice, maybe a board meeting, and those kind of very specific brainstorming meetings, etc. So the adoption of metaverse, virtual reality technologies as an additional channel for richer ways of hybrid work will definitely become a reality. I think the technology is there. It already exists in the consumer world, So the pipe about the metaverse is particularly funny for anyone who plays video games, because we've been playing in metaverses for the last 10 years, right? And they're very, very rich. It's really a matter of finding the right use cases and having it come into the enterprise. And I think that's definitely going to happen. Clearly, I think the third larger sort of things that I definitely see changing is the change in the role of how we think about the CIO, how we think about things like workplace technologies and how we spend money on it. If employee experience continues to become more and more critical, I think the empowerment of executives who have a wider ambit outside of just IT to be in charge of technology and employee experience will keep growing. We're already seeing some of our top customers hire and appoint a VP of employee experience who's at the intersection of HR, IT, and operations. And this is often a very hard position to fill, because it's very hard to find someone who is able to have this kind of interdisciplinary mix, but it is absolutely going to happen. And this therefore will mean it will change the way they spend on IT. I think the idea of a $500 million cloud transformation of only migrating a bunch of applications to the cloud, it will be a thing of the past. Companies will say, you know what? No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm going to take a persona of people, right? My most critical, let's say frontline staff. And I want to change their lives. I want to make them so tremendously productive that I'm able to hire the best talent and give customers the greatest experiences. And to do that, I need a bunch of technologies on the front end side. I need a bunch of technologies on the HR side, on hiring side. I need a bunch of technologies on the workflow side. So I want a partner who can do all of that together, as opposed to do them in silos as they are done today. So I think the way we invest in IT will definitely change in 5 years. The nature of RFPs, the nature of the way customers will approach a company like TCS or any technology provider will fundamentally change. The fourth thing, obviously, is that every business will essentially start treating certain IT and digital skills as core competencies and not something that they can outsource. And I definitely see big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and a range of these kinds of technologies. And in the case of, say, financial services, maybe blockchain and others, they will not treat this as, oh, I understand business, so let me work with someone on technology. Is not going to work. And I think you will start to find companies beefing up their IT and digital talent at an unprecedented scale. And we've seen this happen in waves. As I've been in the IT industry for 23 years, we saw the first wave when companies essentially hired a bunch of mainframe engineers and tried to do everything in-house. And then they said, you know what, we're not very good at it, so we're going to let TCS do this over in India, right? And at then some point of time, when the first generation of the .com happened, they said, you know what, this is important, so we're going to bring it all in-house again. And then they realized the complexity was so hard. And by now, companies like TCS and others had so much skill that it said, we really can't do this. No, you got to do this again. And when digital came, it's starting to come back again. So this is a cyclical thing. And I think it will continue. But it's pretty evident that every company, every business is going digital. And therefore means that digital skills are not something that you can entirely outsource. And you will have to bring them in-house. So the war for talent, and therefore brings me to my final point, the war for talent will just get worse and worse. And therefore companies that have the most flexible approach to hiring, the approach to work, will essentially succeed. So just these are my predictions.
I love it, Ashok. We'll hold you to those. That was beautiful. Thank you for giving us that wide spectrum of views into the future there. So Ashok, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experience, your insight and wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.